I'm making this video in response to a question that came up on one of the Hatch digitizing groups on Facebook. And in the question being asked, it prompted me to learn a little bit more about something that I thought I knew, but I didn't. And what the question is can I adjust the stitch length on a sashiko motif in the program? And there's been a little bit of discussion about it. And my first thought was that yes, you could adjust the stitch length. Well, you know what? Originally, I was actually kind of wrong, but I'm actually also right. What am I going to do here? I've got this little design on my screen, and it's just a single repeat of one of the sashiko designs. So I'm just going to do a little bit of review to educate us all and remind us all about motif stitches. So we usually get to them by coming into our toolbox for digitizing. And we can select any one of these tools here. We could pick a rectangle, we could create ellipses, we could come on to an open or closed shape. So I'm just going to say, let's digitize an open shape. Let's select our motif category. Let's select a category. We're going to Sashiko because that's what the question was all about. And if we select one of these designs and we draw a line on our design screen, there we've got two repeats in this situation with that particular motif that I just selected. Now this design, when we select it and when we create it, we can make some adjustments to it. We all know that. As we move on down the bottom of the screen here, we can see that we can adjust the width of the design. That's how long, how wide each one of the motifs is, how high we want them to be, and how far apart or close together we space them. But there isn't a way right here to adjust how long these stitches actually are. And if I come into my design setting right here, and if I look at background and display colors, and I select my needle points to be black so that I can see them, um, actually, what I'm going to do here too is I'm going to change this to a lighter color. All right. And when I'm out of true view and I'm just into the stitch mode or design view of this, and you can see my little black points are all of these stitch points right in here. So the first thing that you would want to do is find out how far apart are these stitches actually anyway. Turn on your M for measuring things it's on your keyboard, and the little ruler comes up and you can just zoom in here and you can measure a stitch length. So let's say that one there is about 2.43 millimeters long. That's a nice, reasonable stitch length. From here to here, that is 4.88. It's a little bit less than 5 millimeters long. Again, that's a nice, reasonable stitch length for this entire length. And I'm going to talk briefly about stitch lengths. Now, how would we know what's going to be a reasonably good stitch length or when it might be not a good stitch length? I like to refer back to the sewing side of my sewing machine. You know, on most sewing machines, when you are in a straight stitch, the maximum stitch length is usually about 5 millimeters because that's about the distance that the feed dog can move your fabric. So 5 being a relatively long straight stitch length. Um, but when you're in a decorative stitch mode on your sewing side of your machine and you're doing a satin stitch, let's just say that's a very close together, zigzag stitches going back and forth. On my sewing machines, my maximum stitch width is 9 millimeters. So basically that's telling us that, even up to a 9 millimeter, a straight stitch could be, might be a little bit vulnerable to being snagged, but it's still within the reasonable zone. Okay. So when I'm thinking about creating longer stitches on an embroidery design, I kind of like to try to keep that in mind. Anywhere between 5 and 9 can look really nice. You have to be a little bit careful depending on what you're going to do with this design because you don't want to get them too long because then you will have stitching problems. And a lot of embroidery machines also have maximums and minimums for stitch lengths. So keeping all of that information in mind, let's see if we can adjust the stitch lengths on these two different motif stamps that I've brought in. Well, this is the one I brought in, right? I'm also going to bring in one that's a curved line just as a demonstration. Let's come back to motif stamp. Let's pick This one maybe. Okay, so here it is on screen. It's hanging onto my cursor. I'm going to say enter and escape. So I've got one there that we can look at with stitch lengths as well. I'm going to get rid of this line so we don't complicate our lives too much. All right, so another little thing you may not have known about motifs is that when they're in the motif category, they are ESA files. But once we have used the motif stamp to bring in that very same design, it now turns into an EMB. And when we look at these motifs over here, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Excuse me for a moment. You can see that each one of these motifs came in as a grouped design. Well, if I come over and I ungroup them, now they're all separate little pieces. If I select any one of these little pieces, we're going to see that it's a single run. It is an outline stitch and it's a single run. And here are the stitch settings that were used to create this design, possibly, okay? The default in the program is typically it's always going to come up at 2.5 unless you have changed your template. And the minimum is going to be 0.8. That's just good digitizing sense. But we want to make this a big, long one stitch. If I select it over here and I come on down to the stitch length, I'm going to type in 9. Actually, because I don't remember what I actually even measured it at a while ago. Notice what happens on the screen. I'm going to zoom in. Notice the black stitch points. Oh, you know what I'm going to do? I better, first of all, hide everything else. Hide unselected, so we don't get confused with things that are overlapping. Okay, select it. Change the stitch length to, let's just type in an 8 and see what happens. All the black stitch points disappeared. So now we've got great big long stitches. Let's do the same thing for all of the other pieces, or several of them anyway. Let's hide this one. So once we select this one, let's take it up to an 8. The stitch lengths disappear. And you know, this is the way that we can change our stitch length. So once we've made all the changes here in the objects, what we will do with them is we would select them all once again. Let's unhide them. We would select them all again. And what we would do then is we would go ahead and group them again. And then we could come up to create a motif and we could save this as a new motif. Now, one of the things that I personally have done when I create motifs that are based on built-in stitches, and I've done this several different times when I have decided that I want a slight difference to one of the ones that's built in. These were normally single motifs. I created myself a single motif altered category in my motif sections. And what I have done with them is I have saved my new ones here. And I usually give them a name that's very similar to the original design. And I'll just also include some information in the way that I describe it for how I changed it. Okay, let's just say, for example, that I say that I'm going to save this one, but I made it long stitches or something. I would include that in the name. I'm not going to find that again, am I? I don't want to waste too much time here on the video, but you get the idea of what I'm saying. Okay, so go ahead and save it as a new motif for yourself. That's how simple it is to change the stitch length. All right, but what about when we've got a curved design like this one here? This is where you would need to be a little bit more cautious. You know, we could go ahead and measure stitch lengths here as well. Let's just go between this stitch point and this one here, about 1.5. 1.5 is really kind of short. I don't know how big this entire motif is. We could, again, we could change stitch lengths on here, but you need to keep in mind this time that if you start getting into too long of stitch lengths, you might destroy the nice smooth curve that this has. So let's just say we're going to hide anything that's not selected. Come up here and let's look and see what the outline stitch on this one. Again, you know, what did I just measure that at? Let's just say I want to move this one all the way up to 5. I want to really lengthen them out. What's going to happen? Will it allow me to? You know, I didn't see much change there. What happens if I change it to 7 millimeters apart? You know, I'm not seeing any changes here on this curved one. So in this case, I don't want to stay too long trying to figure out how long I'd have to make those stitches to make it longer. You might want to just completely redigitize it. Come into your digitize toolbox, create an open shape, maybe as a single run, and redigitize that and create longer stitch lengths. I don't know, like I started off by saying, you've got to use some wisdom here in adjusting stitch lengths and so on and so forth. But anyway, I just thought I would cover that fairly briefly about how you can come in here and you can alter some of these things that you might want to have look different. Okay, hope this video taught you something. I know I learned something just by thinking about it a little bit. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye for now.